I felt that in many instances, I worked initially for the UAW and then back with the American Federation of Musicians, Local 802, which was a left-wing union at the time and still may be. And then I did more work for the UAW, and I also worked on unemployed organizing, where there was a tremendous amount of disdain for workers who are unemployed. And I also learned a lot in terms of how to pressure state actors, just in terms of tactics and strategy. And then I also helped organize the foundation of the new caucus, and that was an exciting event. Some of you may be familiar with that, because how many of you know this is the union that represents PSC CUNY, the staff and faculty of the university, including mostly adjunct workers. And so, as a consequence of that, I fell into kind of a sense of cynicism. You know, I was always a Marxist by the time I was 18. I would tell people when I was 6, I was an atheist, and by the time I was 18, I was a Marxist. So they told my mother, she said, what are you doing in life? And she didn't want me to be a lawyer or a doctor. And so I said, well, I'm a Marxist. And she said, no, we got into trouble for that in Germany years ago. But anyway, so, I'm always willing to change my perspective, but not my principles. And so I could be, the book has flaws, obviously, including editing flaws, as Joe pointed out. Although I highly recommend Haymarket as a publisher. I think they're probably up and coming the most important left publisher because of their ecumenical stance on issues and the fact that they really care about the work that they put out. But anyway, getting back to my background, so I worked in a union, and I happen to have 4 brothers. There are really one, 2 brothers, sons, but I have 4 brothers and no sisters. And they are all musicians, or at one time in their life musicians. And so it was very hard to find union jobs back in the early 90s. You know, I was graduating and figured out what am I going to do? I get a union job. And so in the late 80s or early 90s, so in 1990 I got a job with Local 802 of the American Federation of Musicians. And, you know, the first person or the last person hired usually gets the most difficult jobs to do. The organizing tasks are impossible for everyone else. And so I thought, okay, let me just do it. It was organizing a really rapacious conductor out in Long Island who employed something like 150 people. He didn't pay, he collected money, he got money from the government, kind of like the banks do, and didn't pay the musicians. Many of them were Broadway musicians and so forth. And so many of them did club dates and so forth. And the club date is the wedding and bar mitzvah circuit. And that's how a lot of people make their money. It's a marginal form of employment to become a musician. And very few people who seek to become major musicians, whether they're pop stars or classical artists. I know some people don't like to make that distinction, but I do. Not necessarily, but serious people. So a serious artist could be pop artist as well. So I don't make that distinction. But however much you devote time as a jazz musician or a classical musician to your work, it didn't really matter how much people got paid in some respect because you really needed to get a job. And so I saw a union that had the right to strike, signed a side letter that said we revoked the right to strike during the terms of the contract. And you know, American labor law allows us to strike at any time, but unions themselves have given that right up. And so, you know, we could say that there's an attack that we're facing by management, by the capitalist class, by the financial sector, etc., that's gone on. But this is part of a 40, 45-year trend, maybe longer, much longer with respect to unions. And 802, which was a union that was a communist union, I think they had some CP affiliation, I believe so anyway, signed the side letter with marginal, precarious, we don't use the term, but people who had to work really hard on weekends at these really outrageous weddings. You can imagine having to do that over and playing the same music over and again. I guess Broadway is pretty tough too, even though because you got to play the same thing. And as the side letter said, okay, you get this wage increase, which is probably not much more than the equivalent of wage increases that you get with respect to standard means by which inflation goes. So people really didn't get anything tangible. They got some money put into their health fund. It sounds like an adjunct, actually. That's exactly what they were. And yet they didn't have the right to strike because there was a side letter that the workers did not see in their voting on this. And so a colleague of mine at the time and me organized a resistance to our own union's contract. And so I got fired after I quit. I quit for valid reason. I think that wasn't the reason why I quit originally, but they fired me afterward, which was I think the singular time that ever happened. And so they fired me after I quit, and then I worked with other community organizations and community types of unions. And then we had 1995, the Sweeney New Alliance came into existence, and I thought, well, okay, let's give this a shot. These people are trying to do something new. And so I didn't necessarily buy into it, but I expected a lot more from the New Alliance. I think many of us here around the table recognize that, and the implosion of organized labor in this country in 2005, when maybe a good thing. I don't think it really mattered, frankly, but I also think that the SCIU represents a democratic form of unionization. Notwithstanding, so I worked on community campaigns where we were working in consort with a number of community organizations in the Lower East Side back in between 1996, so after this happened, and well, a few years after it happened, and in 2001 to be exact. And over that period of time, we formed a community labor coalition. We formed something I was talking to Marina about, the Lower East Side Collective. And the biggest mistake that I could never, we aligned with the local Democratic Party. And I can't forgive myself for that. And although on the other hand, it might have helped in some ways. But we did that. It wasn't my choice. It was just the way things were structurally arranged. And that the leader came out of a left background, a Puerto Rican woman who, by the name of Margarita Lopez, who talked a very good game, but she was authoritarian in her leadership strategies. And I don't like to be yelled at. I don't think any of us like that, or admonished, because I think when you do something right, and I don't believe in secrets necessarily, unless they're secrets that are extremely important about people's personal life. I think that issues that are related to people's lives should be discussed by everyone. So anyway, that wasn't the worst thing of it. Margarita Lopez used it as partially, she helped us in some ways. That could be Dario. So anyway, I'll just tell you reasons why. That's Dario. Okay, so I don't think I need to speak. I can continue that conversation at some other point. Anyway, I'm very much interested in this process of workers' democracy as an alternative, or actually the only alternative to, one of the only to actually existing traditional unions. So I just talked a little bit about myself. I know others have spoken about themselves while I was here, while I was gone, but perhaps Dario wants to talk a little about himself and what brought you to work on. I mean, you are have written extensively on workers' councils throughout your career the last several years.
Right. Well, on one hand, I think that anything in society should be under control of workers and communities. And I think we have to think also about not just simple workers' control, but how to evolve that into a broader model. So I think there are different interests always. So take a factory. You can have different interests between surrounding communities, the workers, and the consumers. So the question is how to make it fit, you know, because like workers might have the interest simply to produce more to keep the factory working and invest more in a second line, for example, but not into the filter, for example. And maybe the communities around would say, well, first the filter and then the second line. Or, for example, a factory could have the interest to simply produce more at a cheaper price, but communities or consumers might say, no, we prefer to pay a bit more and have better quality. I think that the simple workers' control model is a starting point, but if we think about, wow, I haven't seen it. But if we think about how to organize society, we have to combine that with other elements that represent other kinds of interests. Actually, I don't know how I got interested into workers' council. Well, my uncle was a communist, and I had to learn all the communist songs when I was 5 years old.
Although people always have the advantages.
And so I got involved into political militancy quite early. When I was 12, I started organizing in school, and then different movements and stuff. And you usually start always struggling against the bad things and doing research about all the bad things. And after many years of research about whatever repression, U.S. invasions, and whatever, I started thinking about more about how to build something new and how to, like, maybe try to do something. Work on something where you can start building something new and not just have always the feeling you're struggling against an endless machine that is going to kill you someday. So that's mainly why I started working about that. And then when I came to Venezuela, I went to Venezuela first time in 2003, I think. First time I stayed longer, and I found it very interesting. I found it the most interesting social process I've ever seen, simply for the reason that if we think about social change or revolution today, it's more probable that it's going to be like in Venezuela. But, even if I'm not a fan of liberal democracy or elections, but it's probably going to be on a first hand through elections, because there is no chance to get rid today of liberal democracy without getting bombed. So probably, and it will probably be an element that will be existing at the same time with other forms of democracy or people's power or whatever. So that's what I found very interesting in Venezuela, and at the same time also the situation that they simply Chavez won elections, but that didn't change all the people that were living there. And it's also a big difference to any kind of whatever armed revolution where you have a collapse of the whole institution that you have before, and they start building up from zero. And you have a totally different situation in Venezuela, where simply it's the old institutions that they weren't made for social revolution, they weren't made to have the people participate more. You have the same people working there, and that's probably the same situation we will have in many processes of social transformation. And it's a hell, it's a mess, so, because many things don't work, and the government declares something, and quite a great part of the bureaucracy, or even of the ruling party, has other interests and doesn't do it. So you have all these. It's a slow process, and it's really a mess. But I found it very interesting because I think it's the nearest thing to what we might develop somewhere else as a process of social transformation. And the same question, especially about the factories or workers' control, because I don't think we will make a revolution and then everything will collapse and the workers have to take over the factories because otherwise they're not working anymore. That was the situation in other revolutionary processes. And it was not necessarily because of the high evolved consciousness or organizing of the workers, but they simply had to do something because the production didn't exist anymore, everything broke down. And it's a total different situation if you want workers' control, but there is no need to set it up because capitalism is still working like it does. So that's it's a very interesting process because you suddenly figure out that most of the workers are not interested in workers' control. They want their money, the beer, that's it. And then there is a process of transformation because they said in Venezuela, for example, in first hand, when conflicts in different private-owned factories broke out, the workers usually took over the factory and asked the government to expropriate it. And they thought that will solve the problems. And now, after a few years, they recognized that it didn't solve the problems, but it just shifted let's say, the level of conflict. Because now it shifted to the state. Because the state is guaranteeing, the workers their workplace, but even if the official orientation is to set up workers' control, usually the administration sent by the government has no interest in setting up workers' control. Because and I think that's an inherent mechanism in any institutions. Any institution that as an institution, you don't give away power. And you usually try to reproduce and enlarge your power. So you, and especially in times of transition, when any institution is questioned, every institution tries to prove that they're doing something. To prove that, they don't give away the control to somebody they can't control, they try to keep it. So now you've got in Venezuela, in probably all nationalized factories, conflicts between the workers and the administration. Because after a while, the workers started recognizing that, first, the government didn't solve their problem. Second, parts of the government, even if the official orientation is workers' control, but parts of the government and of the still ruling class have objective no interest in workers' control because they still live of the old economic model, and that will break down if there is workers' control, because workers' control would be the only guarantee to avoid corruption or to at least lower the law. In all these business in most of the world are working on the base of corruption. So, especially in countries like Latin America, Asia, or whatever. For example, the aluminum production in Venezuela is 40% cost. 40% of the cost of the production is corruption. So the production cost is higher than the world market price right now. But the thing is, how does it work? Well, there is an influence out of different factors. It's like regional administration and politics and the administration of the factory that earn more money if, for example, they buy spare parts or machines or whatever with certain resellers. So they have no interest in developing some kind of service that produces these parts or buy them, for example, in the country. Then you have all the transnational aluminum companies. All these companies have people that are traveling around the world the whole day and knock at every factory and try to buy aluminum, tons of aluminum, paying cash and below the world market price. And what they buy is practically the amount of aluminum that all, like Glencore or all these transnational companies use to fill up gaps or whatever. But it means that in these countries, like they usually, well, sometimes they buy it by corruption, like they pay workers or supervisors or whatever to take out the aluminum, or they handle out prices with the directors of the factories. That's happening all over, and that's strong pressure on these factories all over, and especially, like, I know the example of Venezuela now quite well. And the only ones that have an objective interest in changing that are the workers in the communities. So they have to take over, otherwise there won't be any social transformation or revolution. And it's interesting because this process in Venezuela has the support of Chavez, but not of most of the rest of the government. Most of the rest of the government is involved into corrupt practices, etc. But Chavez, for example, Chavez named for all the basic industries in Venezuela 17 factories: aluminum, steel, iron, whatever. Workers as presidents for all the factories. Before that, he worked out a plan with 300 workers out of different collectives from the factories that they called Guayana Socialista 2013 to 19. It's a plan how to restructure the whole basic industries and turn them into workers-controlled industries. And it was the agreement between Chavez and the workers. But when the whole administration didn't follow that, these politics, Chavez simply nominated 17 workers out of these collectives as presidents of the factories. And there's an interesting thing about what you told about unions, because now you have a situation, for example, now Casa just visited them a few weeks ago. Let's say there are three big currents of unions. One is, let's say, Bolivarian revolutionaries that are supporting workers' control, and out of their rank and file is the director, the president now of the factory. Then you've got more, reformist or whatever Bolivarian union, and you've got the old Acción Democrática, corrupt social democratic, whatever union. But the situation now that there is workers' control is that the Bolivarian Reformist Union is the only one opposed to the workers' control and tries to boycott the president named by Chavez. The revolutionary Bolivarians, are supporting him, and even the other union by Acción Democrática is supporting workers' control. And walking around the plant, I had quite an interesting experience, and it reminded me the writings of the councilists of the early 20s in Germany, because when they analyzed the workers' councils in the factories, they said that a typical thing is that if you start working and discussing in a council, the party question is not relevant anymore. The parties disappear. And that's what exactly happened. Apart from the Bolivarian Union that is against workers' control, you talk to the workers of the whatever right-wing social democratic union or whatever, and they have a complete workers' control discourse. It's like, for example, they had to close down one line and in Alcázar, and they transferred the workers, and the workers by themselves decided to make up a department where they started inventing and producing spare parts for their own aluminum industry, and developed already different replacements and things that are much better and cheaper than the ones that they buy usually officially outside. And all these people from this department are from the right-wing union. But if you talk to them, they start talking about, the creativity of workers that can then develop and are supporting totally the workers' control model. So it's quite interesting how these
You're not talking about the leadership, you're talking about the...
I'm talking about the rank and file, yeah.
Do each of these three unions operate in all the factories, or...
No, it's always factory unions, and the typical thing is also that it's not just usually you have one union in a factory, and the different lists have elections, and then the unions compose following the votes, the different lists.
So
and,
one of the three gets elected in each.
Yeah, it's not one of the three because it happens, what always happens with leftists, the revolutionary left is working together, but it has got three lists. So they didn't win the elections, even if they have in assemblies full support. Because now at Casa works that they usually, if they have to decide to declare something, the president does a big assembly at 6 o'clock. 5:45 before the first shift begins in front of the factory, and then you've got departments, also department assemblies. So they've got full support by the workers for the workers' control model. So the right wing, the reformist Bolivarian Union is just, it's about 150 people that are not working because during former presidents they got all their payment for not working by being supposed union delegates. And but all the rest supports the workers' control model. But even so, the left didn't win the elections in the union. But you can see there how quite a lot of elements. While we were doing the book, we were reading like what happened during the last 100 years, and like especially these discussions among the workers reminded me very much the writings of the 20s. They said that suddenly suddenly the if you belong or not to a party or a current or whatever, it doesn't have any meaning anymore if you're talking about how to organize concrete things and questions in the factory. So that, very interesting. And apart from that, well, I think it's especially in times of crisis. We don't say that capitalism is a continuous crisis, but when it gets stronger, I think that this question about workers' control gets more becomes more important and more central again, because many enterprises, many factories will be simply abandoned or closed down by the capitalists. So the question is what to do with them.
Well, can you explain a little bit, because when you write and talk about Venezuela, you talk about this process also as class struggle.
Yeah.
So workers looking to try to take over their factories in that struggle, even though Chavez is saying it's okay. And there's so it's interesting because like in Argentina where workers are taking over workplaces, they're not talking about class struggle as what they're doing. It's just, well, we need to survive. So this is what we do to survive, and here are these obstacles, and we do this to survive. But in Venezuela, it sounds like it's cast in a more class contentious kind of way.
Definitely, I think because also the frame is bigger, you know. So the question in Venezuela is not just taking over the factory and changing the factory, but it's trying to build a socialism. So after a few years in the process, more and more people get aware that if there is, who has got an objective interest in changing things, and that's the class. So it's class struggle, and the class struggle is also penetrating the institutions and the government, and you have got these like confrontations on any level. So you might have people from institutions, from government institutions that are like the absurd situation that it's an official orientation to build workers' councils in enterprises, institutions, factories, all over. So it's the same institutions that send out people doing workshops and doing political workshops with the workers to teach them workers' control, co-management, workers' history, whatever, and to set up workers' councils in the factories. And, at the same time, usually, so one institution sends out somebody to do all the teaching, to do all the workshops and everything, and then when they start organizing the workers' council or the factory council, the same institution, but another branch of the institution, tries to prevent that they take control. Because well, it's different interests also inside the same institutions. But I think that the clear idea that it's a class struggle is simply because it's in a bigger frame, you know? And then you start thinking, okay, even if the official politics are like that, and Chavez declares all these things, why don't they do them? You know, and if you start analyzing why certain people don't do certain things, I think you get automatically to class structures, because there are people that have an objective interest in changing things and others that don't.
So this book is organized in a way that we start with theoretical examples, and I would say that I don't agree with every chapter in the book necessarily. I think that it represents a kind of ecumenical perspective of many different people in the theoretical section of the book, but I think there's a common interest in worker control that is found in the first theoretical segment of the book, the first part of the book, where people from different political tendencies are writing about it, from anarchist to Fourth Internationalist tendencies to communists and beyond, who are looking for a means in which they could find a kind of silver thread in which they could say that this is something that we can hold on to. Because one of the major criticisms, which is obviously intimated in the discussion so far, is that workers' councils can only exist for a specific period of time. They're marginal, they'll be crushed after a period of days, years, months, years, and in fact we've seen that happening, but my response to that is that that may be true, but we always see them advancing over and over again. Every single year or several years, you'll find new workers' councils developing throughout the last 100 years. So there must be something about the aspiration of workers that is important, that transcends the political differences amongst these various people. And then, we can talk about it. Then the next segment of books are, so the first part really does deal with issues related to Paris Commune. Sheila Cohen talks about the kind of in a interesting way, her take on workers' councils. While they may not be successful, at least we tried. And I actually don't agree with that perspective, because, or at least it's a idea that we have to strive toward. And yes, I agree with that part of it, but, and I do take a lot of succor in the fact that many workers' councils have been successful over certain periods of time. The Paris Commune, for 2 months perhaps, represents one example. And yet we have others that argue on the centrality of workers' councils, like Victor Wallace, who argues that they're essential for true democracy in the workplace. Then you could probably talk more about Bennett's piece on workers' control. He seems to come out of a anarcho-syndicalist perspective, using the work of Anton Pannekoek and Karl Korsch on the importance of the moment and taking control, and something I think we all agree upon, although with variations, that unions themselves could be a source, and Dario just spoke of it, of resistance to workers' control. I actually am very interested in the idea of rank-and-file workers from highly right-wing unions, or liberal, I consider it the same, unions to be actually taking power away from their unions in some ways. That reminds me of the German Revolution, the Communist movement, and that's actually very interesting. And something we talk about in the chapter about the problems and difficulties that take place, which you can elaborate on. But I think I'm kind of trying to summarize the first part of the book, and I'm asked these questions all the time, and I think about it all the time. Well, so how do we sustain a work? Is this some kind of pipe dream, something that is not reality? And I would say absolutely not, because we have many examples of it, so it's certainly a case, but how can we consolidate this power that workers gain? And I would take the position that workers are always ahead of their leaders. That, and that is not a vanguardist position, but maybe it's a workers' vanguardist position, in the sense that that the workers themselves know more about what's going on. They're much more interested in, and maybe this kind of responds in a kind of nuanced way to your point that is well taken, that they're engaged in class struggle, but they're also opposed to bureaucracy within their unions, this ossification, this collaboration that unions have with management, and the unions have failed to engage in class struggle over so many years, which is where we are now, what has got us to this point, in my view. Do you want to talk about this, the early period? I had to do these presentations, but you could. The second set of chapters deal. The second part of the book, Dario knows it as well as I do. That better. You can want to talk about Italy, which I think is one of the most interesting examples. There's a very interesting quote. First of all, we can talk about the German one, which I think is one of the most interesting. The shop stewards movement. I read the chapter many times over, and I also know the writer fairly. I've never met him, but these days you can know people without having met them. It's kind of strange, very strange.
Well, we knew each other for years before.
Right, that's true. Right. And we hate each other. Yeah, that's true. So there is something to be said for. I don't believe in social capital or social networks, but I just think there's only one form of capital. But anyway, what I would say is that the council communists were extremely important, because here is these are unions that are communist-based with big C unions that are chartered by them and have gained a lot of at least encouragement by the Bolshevik Revolution. And yet at the same time, they are resisting bureaucracy within those unions. And so what's so interesting about this, and you probably can elaborate on this more than I can, is the fact that the people who led the Council of Communists essentially said, okay, union, you can do whatever you want, but we're going to be engaged on a shop floor type of activities. And that's why it's called a shop steward type movement, because essentially you had a democratic process within the shop floors themselves. This aspiration of workers to control and to create there was a German Revolution, obviously, that lasted a very, very short period of time, that created an idea that something could be better. And yet, not a third way, but a fourth way, or maybe a fifth way, I don't know. How you would characterize Council Communists, I would say maybe a fifth way. They're not Fourth Internationalists, but they are a breed of democratic socialists who believe that everything has to be run at the shop floor level, and that you cannot engage, they can't have democracy without workers' control. I think that's actually true. I think that if we talk about workers' democracy, we have to look at it not as bottom-up. I don't like that phrase, bottom-up, anymore. We've heard that in the union movement all too long. I like your terminology, horizontal.
Well, does Zapatista say, from below and to the left?
Yeah.
Where the heart resides.
Because I don't think we need to go up.
I don't want to go up.
Yeah. I think we just...
But are we talking about, just to clarify, you're talking about like the early 1900s up until about 1920, so kind of the councils before revolutions and the taking power kind of
Yes, and the Bolshevik Revolution, and also the one that preceded it, there was a workers... I mean, the chapter, I have to say that I'm happy with a lot of the chapters, and it's not because I care about these issues. That's actually why I'm happy about it, and they're very, very interesting. The chapter on the Bolshevik Revolution is really interesting. It's written by I believe a Fourth Internationalist by the name of David Mandel from Canada. He teaches at the University of Quebec, Montreal, and known him for a while through the internet or through the phone. And yet, the chapter is so interesting. And everyone's read Lars Lee's work, a person who is probably one of the biographers of Lenin. But Mandel is not a biographer of Lenin, although he's more of a Bolshevik. And what he's arguing is that basically he's going back to the archives, the same archives that Pipes, I forget which one of it, was it Daniel Pipes? whichever is the father. The same archives that were traversed by Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker, the same archives that Robert Service looked at. And he comes up with a completely different analysis. He said, well, if you really look at these archives, you can see that there is a working class root that is demanding the power of workers on the shop floor, that they're making the same kinds of demands that you're talking about in Venezuela. We need more government support. We're fighting against these corporations, these businesses, the state, the social, whatever, the Kranskyites, and we need more support. So it's really it's a vanguard, it's a workers, there's a lot of critiques about Lenin and how you want to couch him, and he's a very contentious figure historically, not so much for me, but for some other people. But it just depends on who you read. And I think that what Mandel is trying to convey is the fact that just go back to the archives and see what the workers actually said, and what the workers actually engaged in, the kinds of activities of taking control over garment factories, over steel factories. And I think Haymarket published another previous book by his name Murphy, I forget his first name, on that same subject. It's a brilliant book on the formation of Soviets, which is really a form of workers' control. Maybe you want to talk about the Italian. I can talk about that. No, I'll let you talk about this. It's a brilliant chapter by Paolo Pietro. And I can tell you why, but you probably can elaborate. Well, maybe who was the anarchist leader in the early I forget his name. I should know it. Not him. Not Erko, the other guy. Where Gramsci, who was the leader of the Communist Party, is having a debate or discussion, and De Pietro has it. It's a very interesting discussion that they're having, and the anarchist leader is saying, if you take power, this is during the period of the Turin. I'm trying to think of the period that's known as the Red 2 Years in English, that you have a period in which the auto factories are operated by workers for 2 years. That's unbelievable. So there is a degree to which we can think of sustainability with respect to actually controlling factories. So anyway, what's so interesting is that there's this discussion. I think it's just kind of interesting that the anarchist is saying, Antonio, I don't know how they say it. You want me to read it? No, you read it. Read it, because I think it's very interesting.
This one is the anarchist Garino.
Yeah, that Garino. I think he's not a revolutionary.
Gramsci opposing political views about the future factory councils were underlined by Garino. Gramsci's agreement with our proposal for factory councils stopped precisely at the issue of the state, of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He told me, not only are we working together now, but we must do so until the overthrow of capitalism. At that point, if there are different assessments by us communists and by you, the libertarian communists, will each go our own way. Until then, we had worked together in practical action, union action, preparation for the revolution, even armed preparation. In his discussion with Gramsci, Garino clearly indicated his fear that the revolution would devolve into a one-party state dictatorship. I said, look, Gramsci, I think that the dictatorship of the proletariat will eventually mutate and degenerate into the dictatorship of a party, or even worse, of an individual. Gramsci replied, no, Garino, that can't happen. The party will not allow one man to take the reins of power and do whatever he likes. I'm not convinced, I said. And I tell you what I believe. When you take power, we'll be the first to be shot. Gramsci jumped to his feet with that big bushy head. Garino, no, don't say that. That will never happen. Yes, with Gramsci, there was an incredibly close relationship. Garino, oral testimony.
And there's a continuation of that, those kinds of discussions. I guess somebody could probably write a book on these discussions between the libertarian socialists, others, whatever they are, or anarchist tendencies, movements. And people like Gramsci, who I don't think, obviously, ended up as a big C communist, really. And it's kind of funny saying that, no, we're not going to kill you, don't worry. So anyway, but that's a question.
Another chapter very interesting is the one about Argentina in the 70s.
Yes.
Because it's again a situation where there is no real revolution, but at the same time an effort and the social push to take over factories and introduce workers' control. So I find that also very interesting.
So at some point, I would love in our discussion to talk a little bit about Argentina now.
Okay.
I mean, just because I think there's the one example of Venezuela, absolutely, as a kind of potential road that we can think about, because I think all of us are here because we're interested in total social transformation. And, okay, so what is that going to look like? I'm assuming too much, whatever, but it's some version of that.
So far.
Right? I just usually assume most people get very technical and make something different. So there's Venezuela, but then in Argentina, there's almost 400 workplaces that workers have taken over, recuperated, intentionally using that language, that they are ours, we're not occupying them, we're recuperating, it's already ours, running them horizontally. Those that have existed, I mean, this is some of them going on for 10 years, and those that have existed for more than 3 years actually do, even if you're going to talk about levels of production on kind of a capitalist model, are doing better than comparative workplaces, industries, whatever that is, whether it's a health clinic or, a metal shop or a print shop. So how does that fit into the conversation about, because they're not identifying as kind of class struggle, it's workplace by workplace, but yet they show a solidarity with one another that's really incredible. And a lot of them, when they have bureaucratic unions, they either take them over or kick them out. So where does that fit in this picture? Is it like there are these two potential paths as far as transformation, or is it exceptionalism? What? Because it's not, I also don't see it as, a lot of people like to identify what's going on in Argentina and say, oh yes, it's kind of like our cooperative movement in whatever part of Europe or the US. It's very different than cooperatives. Workers just saying we're going to run it.
I don't think so. I don't think it's two different ways. I think that, and I don't like states, I don't like parties, and I don't like governments at all, but I think that they will reach the point where, if they want really a bigger transformation, they have somehow to take over government. And the big contradiction with that is that I'm not a friend of government and not of government, and I don't even think that the government can be the agent of change. But I think that the historical experience is that the government can't be the agent of change, so the government can't do a revolution or lead socialism, but if you don't have the government, it will kill you. So it doesn't allow you to build autonomy, because it's not that, the idea is, I think Argentina is very interesting, but it's not thinkable that they just go on at that rhythm and maybe take over more, and then they have 2,000 factories, and then 4,000, and the capitalists and the government are just, okay, and then at some point they will have the majority of the factories. So there will be a breaking point where if the transformation should go further on, they will have somehow to take over government power, and I think that that will be the moment where the problems will start, not end, because the government won't, even if you have the government power, the problems shift, but they don't go away, and it's not even easier, like you can see in Venezuela. It's a big contradiction, a mess, but I think that to my stand now, and that's why I'm working a lot about these things like workers' control or local self-administration, or in Venezuela community councils, and all these things about how to set up a parallel people's power, and how to try to, in this game of class struggle, try to force the government that is supposed to be on your side to do the things that you want, is because I came to the conclusion that it's not the one and not the other. It's not taken that the idea that the Communist parties had for ages and still have, that they take over the government and the government will be the agent of change, that doesn't work. We know that. But at the same time, the idea influenced very much by the French and by others that it's just a social movement and we don't want to have nothing to do with government and we don't want to take over and nothing. I think that doesn't work as well because it's simply the government or the capitalists, they don't allow you to set up autonomy just like that because you want it. So the big question is how to have the government without turning the government into the central agent of change. So the government should be opening spaces so that the new can be coming up from below. And it's a big contradiction, like I said, because no institutionality, no institution, no government has a tendency to, well...
But workers also have the power to create spaces as well.
Oh, sure. But, for example, it's like...
I think the Argentine example is a good example of that.
Yeah.
Where the workers have... And the government's fighting back.
Totally. I mean, they're constantly saying, oh, yes, we're good with you, and we try to evict you all the time. So it's that, both the public face being nice and trying to, but they don't identify so much as a kind of working class politics. Though they're workers and nobody, it's not like the U.S. or other places where people want to identify as middle class. It's not that, but it's not kind of, we are a class in and of ourselves. It's that kind of identity. Which just is an interesting part of the conversation too, which is why I'm so interested in Venezuela.
What about the Dario
class
movement and its...
I think the Dario movement first was kind of unemployed workers, and now have shifted because they don't want to be identified by that unemployed status. So a lot of them some of them have gone with the state, but they were already kind of with the state anyway. But then the other workers who've just not had this kind of precarious, who've never had regular work, won't have regular work, didn't any longer want to be identified with their relationship to work. So there's really not that working class identity. Quite the opposite. People want to have dignified work, but they don't want to be identified as workers in that same way. So it's a different, and I think that's true in a lot of places in the world, which just makes this conversation also more complicated, where workers are working and we're selling our labor, somebody's, whatever, in a very simplistic sense of kind of what is a worker. But nobody wants to identify as workers, which does make it kind of hard to identify as a class. I don't know if other people are like you. Yeah?
Let's say again. It's a different sort of vein of question that I would raise, but so I do a lot of political work and also my research is with Domestic Workers United. So it's interesting to think about the question of workers' control when you think about domestic work, domestic work is a very particularly decentralized industry, but I think it's true of a lot of service work in the U.S. And so I have thoughts on the class question, but it's related because a lot of the women, which is more related to migration status of these workers. So many of them are migrants coming from a range of class positions back home and are advancing to a higher class economically back home, so their identity isn't just tied to their work here in the moment. But it's hard because I think to the extent that people try things around workers' control of domestic work, for example, it does become these sort of co-ops, and they don't really work because, they work for mutual support, like emotionally, or for professionalizing, and sort of increasing the sense of like respectable professional work. But people have to sell their labor at the market rate within capitalism. And so in the service industry, it doesn't really advance people's material interests to have like worker control. So I was just curious if there are examples of non-factory-based workers' control in the book, particularly because the service sector is such a growing sector.
Yeah, there are. But I think the problem is not just the service sector. I think there's a general problem because, like, you had the Fordist factory was inducing to struggle because it made everybody equal. You entered the factory, you were different before, but then you had like 12,000 workers in the factory, and 11,900 had the same paycheck, the same problems, the same work, and whatever. With the change to the post-Fordist production mode, the factory is not homogenizing anymore, but it's splitting. So that's a huge problem anyway, because now if you go, like for example, Fiat had in early 80s 70,000 workers, 68,000 had probably the same contract. If you go now to Fiat, you've got 12,000 workers in the factory, more than 120,000 workers in different sweatshops that are producing but are not part of Fiat. In among the 12,000 workers in the factory, you have probably, I don't know, maybe 4,000 different contracts. They're part-time workers, they're student workers, they're so this is something that like split also the class consciousness. You know? So it's not the service sector is maybe a very visible example. But if you look at the individual reality of people, the factory is the same even if they're all there. It's even if they're all in a factory, it's not like 20, 30 years ago. It's the same situation like in the service sector. So it's I think that it's something that makes class consciousness and organizing difficult. You could say at the same time you can argue with Negri, who says, okay, but now the advances that communism is possible because nowadays the workers have the complete knowledge of production, and so the bourgeoisie is not necessary anymore, because before the workers didn't have the complete knowledge of the whole production process. So the advantage why bourgeois revolutions succeeded in proletarians, not the difference was in the fact that the bourgeoisie was needed to coordinate and organize these processes. And he says nowadays it's not anymore like that. It's totally, bourgeoisie is good for nothing because it's not organized. The workers could do it totally by themselves. So we could say we have, advantages and disadvantages.
The book has a lot of examples, even rural and rural workers in India, transportation workers in Indonesia, and the example that Dario is giving about the Argentine public sector occupations, which I think is very interesting. And actually, I'd like to see here in the city and state.
How do people organize it? Like, what is the control over it? I don't know if that makes sense, but like control over a factory is easy to sort of visualize, or control over things that are productive.
How do you shut down domestic work? How do you shut it down?
Yeah,
There's the question of power.
telephone operators too.
The call centers, I mean, they have organized in some places, but in some places they're not in the same geographic location. So how do you?
Well, the example in the Canadian, British Columbia telecom workers' occupations of 1980-81, there was actually workers who were organizing more effectively and efficiently, actually preceding what Negri was saying. In 1980-81, they were actually delivering the services by occupying them and offering them for free to people who were, at that time, many people actually required telephone service. So that was a very good example, and primarily with female workers who, Elaine Bernard's chapter, who had complete disdain for their treatment. They had a fairly good union, which there was renovated in some ways, and so I think one of the critiques of I like the way Dario answered it. Exclusive factory workers. It has become so segmented in some ways in terms of different categories, almost like a service sector. But within the service sector itself, I think there's also a segmentation and public sector as well, where you have people in the public sector who are working as provisional workers and alongside people who are contracted out workers and so forth, and so forth. I think that consciousness is very important. I think maybe that's what you're talking about. How do you develop the working class consciousness?
If that's even the location, I guess I'm asking that, and I'm also questioning the location or the identity as class relationships. So unemployed workers in Argentina is a great example of people who have precarious work and aren't identifying by class anymore. They're identifying by neighborhood because they're all excluded in these kind of peripheral neighborhoods. So that's the location. So I wonder if some of the conversation is just about relationship to work, but also about, in some places in the world, it's location of where you live or where you circulate.
No, but it's interesting what you say, because what I sustain in my thesis is that the community is the class. So, and that's, I think, quite typical for Latin America. Mm-hmm. So the class doesn't form necessarily at the workplace, but it forms at the workplace in connection with the community, because the primary identification for many people in Latin America is the community, and not in a nostalgic sense or in a folkloric sense, but it's a class dimension, because there's such a big territorial segregation that if you live in a certain community, you have shared class experiences of marginalization, of whatever. And it's interesting because it doesn't even, it's like for example, Venezuela is, if you live in a barrio, in a neighborhood, you have also in the barrio big differences. There might be somebody owning a house with 4 floors and renting, but the moment this person goes to the city, to an institution, to a bank, it's living the same discrimination like any other living in his neighborhood, simply because he's out of his neighborhood. So, and if we look like Chile in the 70s, so what was the strongest support for Allende? Cordones industriales, the factories all around Santiago that were organized not just as factories, but with a strong connection with the community organizing. I think you have the same thing in Venezuela with primary identification, and that's even why at first hand the community councils, like the local self-organization of people, work much better than the factory councils, is because the primary identification of people is with the community. But I sustain that that is a class identification, because it's not because there is the park or because this is your neighborhood for whatever reason, but it's a result of a shared experience of marginalization and of struggles that went on like 20, 30 years or even more, where like they didn't have electricity before. Their parents were struggling for electricity, their older brothers for water, and they are struggling for transport or whatever. So I think that this community identification is a class category.
So class kind of but like relationship to power, relationship to access, not necessarily relationship to production. Just because it's so interesting in the US, everyone's loving this 99% thing, because everyone can fit into it. Like everybody is the 99%, because we don't have access to decision making, power, right? I mean, but it's an interesting thing, because then what are you identifying with? And it's not as a class, but it's definitely as not having access to decision making, power to. So I guess I'm trying to distinguish class.
Because I think, I mean, you can do it analytically like the class, but that's the class. I don't think it always articulates as class. Like you're saying, that there is a class reality there, but it's not often, or maybe right now, it's often not how it articulates, and so then it's complicated. Particularly, I mean, to dominate on my side. So when you do think of workers' control in the domestic work industry, it can be established through a set of specialized skills, right? Like we have the professional skills of baby nursing, right? Which there are. It's a highly professionalized, like, if you actually, like, know that stuff, it's a very complex set of things. Which is complicated, because then people actually are, that's an advocacy based on a professional identity, not like a worker. It's professional worker, but it's emphasizing the professional. You know, I think it's complicated, because sometimes establishing control over a workforce either does the segmentation itself or doesn't necessarily promote the kind of consciousness we would like, right? And so I just think it's I think it's right to sort of step back and be like, that is a class struggle. It is, you know, but I think if we don't engage in how people are articulating that and understanding that, we can run ourselves down some politically bad alleys, you know. And I think it's a complicated moment, because it's not, with the leading classes in the United States, in my opinion, the leading parts of the working class in the US, which is what I know best, immigrant workers, they don't always call themselves working class. It's, you know,
But the class forms a struggle.
What?
Social relations. So.
It does, but what is the form of struggle? I mean, with the class that forms as a professionally identified working class. Am I making any sense? Like,
yeah, well, I think it depends on if they just keep on struggling just in their segment, or if they start developing a different idea of society that goes further than their own reality. That there will be, like, for me, the switching point to say they assume the role of class, and it's not connected. I wouldn't say like many orthodox communists, whatever that is a question of consciousness. They think that it has been also always an instrument for the Communist Party to declare why they have to decide instead of the workers, because the workers can have the right consciousness or whatever. So I don't think it's a question of consciousness, because you can have the consciousness but not the objective situation to develop a different project for society. So I think for me it's the central question, if they assume themselves as class, is the question if a project for a different society, moreover their own needs, is defined at least, or tried to go this direction.
I mean, also, you know, I mean, we have to. I agree with what you're saying. I also look at immigrant workers a lot, and especially the struggles that they're engaged in on a daily basis. And we know a lot about the domestic workers. And what I know about them is that obviously they're isolated. They're not only isolated in communities, they're socially isolated from everyone else. I mean, again, although they may meet in the park or at various other locations, but their relationships are very different than most workers. And I think their class, I'm not going to get into the consciousness issue, but just the class relationship is very clear. That it's antagonistic toward whoever is in charge. I mean, obviously, it could be. Oh, you know, I mean, they negotiate. You know, there's a lot of literature on the subject. They negotiate the relationship with usually other women who are of a different class background. But I think that we could make a mistake of. How should I put it? Well, I think we have to look at the centrality of capital within our society, and that we shouldn't, fetishize these different kinds of relationships that necessarily, that may be exceptions to the rule. I'm not saying that domestic workers are. I get in trouble with this, but again, I'm not going to. But that it's part of social reproduction, which is part of the capitalist process, and that. I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. That's all I'll say, is that it's a very, very complicated situation. That social reproduction of the upper class is being engaged in by working class women. And that's not nuanced at all, but
they allow the upper class women to
right.
Yeah.
Precisely. Is that okay? I know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's exceptional in some way. I mean, it's exceptional because it's extreme. It's like the extreme of a lot of different social patterns, though. So I think that's probably what's asking about what are the examples of the service work, is because domestic work is extreme socially reproductive. Like, it's extremely isolated. It's extremely decentralized. It's an extreme, but of a pattern that is increasingly a social pattern of decentralized service work, and the dominated is the U.S.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think it's an extreme case, and so it wouldn't make sense to make it be case, but it's an extreme case. It sort of forces a lot of questions, right? What are the relations that happen in reproductive labor, right? What is the control? Where can you exert power and control? Like, I don't want to co-opt the whole time.
You're not at all. I think this is very important.
You know, I think so. It forces a lot of questions.
Yeah, it does. It forces questions that are uncomfortable, that many other groups would say that are uncomfortable, but they're uncomfortable questions for many people, men as well as women. That's what makes it so important and interesting.
But it's also different steps, I think, because one thing is how to organize with people, or how to organize the workers' control with them, and the other one is then, if we come to a discussion, what makes sense in a society and what not. Okay, then we have to rediscuss everything. It's not just about the workers' control. But I think that there are possibilities to, like, for example, I think now I know some farmers cooperatives in Nicaragua, that, in eastern Nicaragua. They, for example, they started working with little farmers that want to have their land. They're not giving away the land. They're not building a big cooperative. So the cooperative they set up is that everybody works his own land, but they coordinate everything. And the cooperative is to buy and share machines, to buy whatever they see, to buy whatever they need, to resell, to organize workshops. They organize everything, but everybody is still working on his own piece of land. So it's not ideal, but it's, you know, if you start with a certain reality that is really individual, maybe this could be a way, for example. On the other hand, I think it makes me think about the importance of social spaces. Because, like, I think that the thing that the community comes back as, or is the dimension of class identification, is also because it's a social space, and the workplace isn't it anymore? You know, it used to be. So, so I think that probably it was a proposal by Marco Revelli, who's an Italian writer, years ago. He wrote a book and he said, he called it the social left, and he said that what is needed is a territorial organization because of the fragmentation of all the different work situations and jobs. What has to be done is a local territorial organization that also brings together all these different individual jobs. It's said very easy, it's done not very easy, but I think that's probably the direction. But I think that's something you can see also in the US, because what kind of union models have been successful here? The ones that started organizing community centers and stuff like that. But if you go one step back, because I always start saying that apart from the fact that we think that workers' control is necessary and makes sense and shared also by, and for example, services should be under workers and communities control. Because we just think how public services are working, then we know when they were in state hand, well, they worked somehow not that good, but okay, whatever. And they were privatized, and it was a mess. That's the experience, and it doesn't matter if it's whatever, the US or Great Britain or Venezuela or India, it's all over the world the same experience. So I think probably the only mechanism to guarantee a balance between effectiveness, price, and social dimension is community control, workers and community control. Because if you, for example, if you start controlling electricity service, energy service by the community, you won't have the case that you accept a service that is very good but much too expensive. But you also wouldn't accept a service that is really cheap or really bad. You wouldn't allow that your neighbor gets cut off electric service simply because you couldn't pay him once. So you would find solutions. I think that probably the balance, especially in the service sector, is that not the individual service, but general services, would be, in my opinion, a combined control between workers and communities. And I also think that it's a quite human condition, because when people talk about how these workers' councils or councils are so strange, weird, or whatever, I don't think so. Because it's usually the first thing that in any experience we have, like it might be university occupation, school occupation, or a problem in the neighborhood or whatever, the first thing people always do is sit together in an assembly and talk about that, and not vote for a leader who decides everything. The human condition, I think, is a collective solution. Like I said before, we have not a problem that this work was homogenizing before and now it's separating. So that makes a lot of things much more difficult.
I think one question that I'm trying to wrestle with is, if you start getting more of an economy where enterprises are run cooperatively with workers' control, how do you get the whole economy to work, as opposed to, well, okay, we'll each be cooperative with our own within our own enterprise, but will relate to everybody in a market or in a capitalistic way, and you could start winding up with capitalism just in a different way and on a different scale. And I have my own thoughts on that, which I'll keep to myself just for the moment because I'm curious to hear what other people are thinking along those lines. To me, it's like a really big puzzle. You know, how do you not replicate capitalism? I mean, it's thinking that where mine is going, where I see some other people going, is try to have everything where it's all the pricing is negotiated, where everybody negotiates with your supplier, with your buyer, and you negotiate horizontally. So somehow you come up with some kind of distribution system that's not market-based. And just to make that work, you probably would have to have everybody's financial information would have to be completely open and open for inspection for everybody and publicly available. But these are just obviously very broad sketches here. I'm curious what other folks' ideas are on how do you keep a market out of it so you don't replicate capitalism.
I think, when you look at the United States and its example of worker control, it's most, in its advanced form was in the 1930s, the late 30s, between 37 and 38, 36 and 39. And I think that people thought that if they get a union, that they would be able to have a revolution. That if the auto workers had the union and were able to gain power, that they would be able to control production. And if you take a look at a lot of the writings by Hannah Flint sit-down strikes or the Emerson Electric occupations and so forth, people felt that they'd stop work as soon as the employer violated any kind of agreement with the rights of the workers in some ways. But I also think that it gained a lot of its inspiration from an idea that if they had a union, they would be we would somehow in some ways create a social society. Probably coming from a notion of the idea that it was illegal for so many years that and industrial workers did not have unions, and all of a sudden if you had one, you could transform society. And then, one can all go back to the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution, where, the idea was basically the revolution would be taking care of everything else. Obviously, that's a bureaucratic model in some ways, potentially, although not initially. I mean, the work of Mandela, I think, shows, not Ernest Davis, Mark Davis shows that these workers wanted horizontal control and they did not want to have any kind of capitalist system.
Right.
The Bolsheviks were the majority, not the Mensheviks. And I think those are significant issues. And a lot of, obviously there were a lot, people expected the revolution to take place elsewhere, as Lenin did and others, but there was the idea that the worker control, the Soviet, which is the worker control, was the revolution. And, obviously in the United States, people, and I go back to that issue of consciousness, didn't have that same level. In the Soviet Union, you did have 40 or 50 years of worker, intellectuals that were developed. I don't think that was developed. You can actually compare also that with Spain and the Spanish Revolution, where you actually had a tremendous amount of intellectual activity amongst workers. They were, in fact, the leading intellectuals of society in the early 30s, so the revolution and beyond. So I think that the revolution itself represents. I think that's a very good example. It was the last chance, people say, the Spanish case, of having a revolution through workers' councils and worker control in the last century.
Well, there was an interesting experiment during the Prague Spring in '68 in Czechoslovakia, down below, where, and interestingly, it was Communist Party rank and file and union leaders who were basically the backbone of this, where they're trying to set up two parallel structures, that they're setting up a system of workers' control where there would be assemblies in each enterprise. In Czechoslovakia, it was a small country, so usually there was one enterprise for any given, one auto manufacturer, etc. So their idea is that they would then create a national structure where everybody would elect delegates, and they actually did have one meeting. Actually, after the tanks rolled in, interestingly enough, it took them several months to get around to stamping that out. At the same time, they wanted to keep the unions in place with the idea that everybody would be part of management and be part of the assembly as part of the workers' control of it. But you also needed a union that's completely separate to represent yourself as an individual, because as an individual you would certainly have contradictions at some points with that, and they wanted to actually keep both of these things and have everybody represented in two different ways. Of course, we'll never know how that would have developed, but there was quite a bit of literature that they developed that I was reading through when I was actually just finished writing a book, taking in some of this stuff, which is part of why I'm very interested in all this. And that they had some very sophisticated ideas, and to me that's probably the biggest crime about the crushing of that, is it would have been such an incredible experiment. Like, okay, they had no contemplation of it not continuing to be state-owned, but that everything was really going to be community-controlled. And they had some pretty sophisticated ideas that, you know, again, we'll never know how it would come out.
We do have a Polish example, but I think that would be probably very different.
Yeah, I think they were going in somewhat different directions. I'm not as familiar with the Polish.
I mean, I think the Polish example is probably driven much by international capital.
Yeah.
And, I'd like to learn more about that.
So Venezuela now has the same discussion. So they keep the unions and the councils in the factories.
Right.
Because they've got different. But the interesting thing, while the councils are not against the unions are against the councils.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting, because in Czechoslovakia, there was the unions that were explicitly behind that.
That's a very interesting example.
Isn't there a division between who makes decisions about production, which is the workers, and who makes decisions about distribution, which is the community council? Or is that my imagination?
Well, up to now there isn't that much workers' control. There's just a few factories that are really under workers' control. They're working quite good, but it should be coordinated between councils and factories. And it's also another question, because if the connection with the communities is not just because of the distribution or because you need another whatever, you have to organize another interest. There's also another question, because if the money is not an incentive anymore, what you earn, you have to create some working in a factory, like Marx said, is not pleasure being workers, industrial workers are drag. So you have to create values. Why should people work in factories? And if it's not the money anymore, you have to create something different. And what they try in Venezuela, and it's also, I think, a consequence out of the Yugoslavian experience, is to connect with the communities. And on one hand, to avoid some like factory egoism or whatever, but on the other hand, to create new values. So the workers are proud to work in that factory because the factory at the same time serves the community. So for example, like the education missions are in the factory because the community doesn't have the space to organize them. Or the doctor that is paid by the factory is also doing stuff for the communities. Or once a week the factory organizes a film presentation. Or whatever. And then a certain amount of the earnings, of the surplus of the factory earnings should be invested into the communities, decided by the communities what they need. And that, I don't know if it will work on the long term, but on the mid-term you can, like the factories I know that work their way, you can notice that the workers are proud to work in the factory because they know it serves the community. You know? And so it's not just a question about different interests, but it's also the question about creating new values, new incentives. Because,
maybe this is why people don't think of themselves as working class, because if the state or the leading institutions is a capitalist state or a state capitalist state like Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, that in the case of Yugoslavia, certainly they had prioritized the factories that were state controlled and not workers controlled, the ones that had a level of capital investment that might have foreign elements to it.